So today I'm going to be making a pair of Golden Hills Turquoise earrings. And to start, I'm going to pick out the two stones I want to work with. Now all of my stones are free form and shape, so I want to try to find two stones that are as similar in shape and size as possible. I think these two stones will work perfectly. Now we're going to first be using 1/8 fine silver bezel wire for the bezel, and I'm just going to take that wire and gently wrap it around my stone. And where the two ends overlap, I'm going to make a mark with my Sharpie so I know where to trim the wire. Now I'm also going to be using flat nose pliers to just work hard on the two ends so they fit nice and snug together and there's no space in between the two ends. And I'm just going to repeat this step for the other stone as well. And as you can see, the bezel looks good and it's ready to be soldered. Now I'm going to be using hard solder for my first soldering operation, and I'm just going to take a very small chip of my hard solder, and I'm going to first flex my piece, and then I'm going to place that small solder chip right up against the seam of the bezel. I want to make sure that the solder is touching the metal when I begin to heat it, and what I like to do is just use my solder pick to guide the solder up along the bezel as it begins to flow. Now I'm just going to double check the fit of the bezel, so I'm just going to put it over the stone to make sure that it has a nice snug fit. Now I did notice that the bezel isn't the perfect shape of the stone, so what I'm going to do is just use my workbench to gently press the bezel so it takes on the shape of the stone a bit more. As you can see, that looks so much better. Now I'm going to be using a black silicone polishing wheel to just clean up the excess solder at the seam of the bezel. The bezels look so much better now, you practically can't even see the seams anymore. Now my bezel wire is a little tall for my stone, so I'm just going to sand it flat a little bit, and this also gets it ready to solder it to its back plate. I'm going to be using 24 gauge sterling silver sheet for the back plate, and I prefer 24 gauge for earrings so they're a bit lighter and more comfortable to wear. It's time to solder the bezel to the back plate, and I'm just going to be using a mesh tray to do this. And I'm first going to start by flexing both sides of my piece, and then I'm just going to place the bezel on top of the back plate. I'm going to be using medium solder to solder the bezel to the back plate, and I like to use a bit extra so that overflowed solder can then be used to solder down the twisted wire to the back plate as well. When it comes time to solder, I like to start by heating the piece from below and then bringing my flame above and just waiting for that solder to flow, but making sure not to overheat the piece. Now I'm just going to be repeating the same steps as before for my second bezel. Now once everything is soldered, I'm just going to place them both into my pickle pot. So I'm going to be using 12 gauge sterling silver twisted wire for the border, and I'm just going to take that wire and gently wrap it around the bezel, and where the two ends overlap, I'm going to cut the wire. Now I really like my wire to fit nice and snug around the bezel, so I'm going to go back and just trim it if needed to make sure that it's the proper fit. Now I want to make sure that there are no gaps at the seam before I begin to solder the wire. And I'm just going to repeat the same steps that I did for my bezel for the twisted wire. I'm just going to flex the piece and add a small chip of hard solder at the seam and slowly heat the piece and wait for the solder to flow. Now once the wire is soldered close, I'm just going to double check the fit one last time on my bezel to make sure that it's nice and snug, and then I can get ready to solder the wire to the bezel and the back plate. And I'm just going to flex the piece and heat from below and above just as I did the other time. This was a successful soldering operation, and now I can get ready to saw out the pieces. The sawing process can be quite tedious. I really like to try to go as slow as possible. And if you aren't super confident with a saw, it's good to leave some room so you don't by accidentally saw off any of your decorative elements. Now, if you aren't super confident with using a jeweler's saw, you can also simply use a pair of cutting shears to just trim along the edge of your piece and remove any of the excess backplate. Now that my pieces are all cut out, I do see that there is a little bit of cleanup I need to do, so I just like to use a sanding drum to just remove any of the excess backplate on my piece. These look so much better now. However, I did notice that there were some marks left in my silver from my sanding drum. So what I'm going to use is a black silicone polishing wheel to just smooth out those edges and remove any marks left from my sanding drum. You can really see the difference that this wheel makes with the two pieces. I'm now going to clean up my other piece and make it smooth just like the first one. Now that the edges are nice and smooth on both pieces, we can begin our last soldering operation. Now I'm going to just repeat the same steps as before. I'm going to flux the piece, but this time I'm going to add a chip of solder, and I'm going to be using medium solder to solder my earring post down. And I'm going to be using a method called sweat soldering. So what I'm going to do is first melt the solder onto the back of my earring. Now once it's melted, I'm then going to take my earring wire and gently place it on the back of my earring and wait for the solder to flow. And I'm going to repeat this step for the other earring as well. I then like to let my pieces cool for a little bit before I place them into the pickle pot. This was another successful soldering operation. Now before I can begin polishing, I'm first going to work hard in my earring post, and I'm going to do this by taking my flat nose pliers and twisting the post in one direction a couple of times and then in the opposite direction a couple of times as well. It's now time for one of my favorite steps, and that is polishing. Now I'm going to be using 3M radial discs to do this, and you want to make sure you use them in the order I've shown below if you want to get a really nice high shine on your piece. Now once I'm done with my radial discs, I'm going to get ready to oxidize my pieces. And I'm going to be using Midas Black Max to do this. Now you're going to need to have a neutralizing bath, and I like to use baking soda and water for this. Now, as mentioned in my previous videos, this oxidizer is extremely powerful and extremely toxic, so it's important to take the right precautions when using it. I like to use a plastic water paintbrush to apply the oxidizer to my pieces, and as you can see, this oxidizer works very fast. Now once I'm done applying the oxidizer to my pieces, I'm then just going to put them into my neutralizing bath. Now to remove the patina, I'm going to be using these foam polishing pads to do so. I really like these polishing pads because they allow you to have full control over where the patina is going to remain and where it's going to be removed. For the last step in the polishing process, I'm going to be using this compound called ZAM. It adds a really nice high shine to your piece and really brings it to the next level. Now, as you can see, there is a bit of the polishing compound remaining on my pieces, so I'm going to need to clean that off. I'm going to be using this Blue Dawn dish soap with a soft bristled toothbrush to just gently scrub the piece and remove any remaining compound. Now that the pieces are all clean and have a nice shine to them, we can get ready for the very last step in the whole process, and that is setting the stones. I like to use my engraver's block to hold the piece in place during the stone setting process. Now, as you can see, my stone fits nice and snug in the setting, and there's absolutely no wiggle to it. I'm going to be using my bezel roller to just gently press the bezel into the stone. I want to make sure I don't use too much pressure because you can run the risk of cracking the stone. I like to just slowly work my way around the entire setting and make sure that there are absolutely no gaps and that the setting is nice and secure on the stone. I'm now going to repeat the previous steps on my second earring, and again, I'm really just going to take my time. You want to make sure that you take care of the stone and the setting, because the last thing you want is to ruin your piece at the very last step after all of that time and work that you put into it. And voila! We are all done. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and as always, thank you guys so much for your support. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to help. Thanks, guys.